Hello, it's Jacob again, and in this one, we're going to be talking about our last topic of the semester, although it's also far and away our longest topic, coevolution of political and economic systems. And our big question that we're seeking to answer with this growth unit is, why is the world the way that it is? What can explain the history and the fates of different countries? That some countries should be spectacularly wealthy and other countries should be shockingly poor. How did that come about? Why did that come about? Why did different societies, all of which are inhabited by the same thing, human beings, despite that common humanity, different societies turned out so different from each other in terms of basic structure and lifestyle? What can explain that? Now, normally this is the point where I'd turn it over to you to give some suggestions, but obviously we're not going to be able to do that. So we'll just go into the maps and the graphs. Firstly, what kinds of patterns can we observe on this map? Well, one thing that immediately stands out to me is that most of the high-income countries seem to be concentrated in the far north of the world and in the far south, with somewhat of an exception in the Middle East. So it seems that the world is broadly divided between a rather poor equatorial zone and then a wealthy kind of, it's not literally subpolar as in climate classification, but, you know, like I said, a far north and a far south. It also seems, too, that the northwest of the world is generally a bit richer. You could definitely say that Western Europe, and more so Northwestern Europe and North America, are a little richer than Eastern Europe. And those wealthy Southern Hemisphere countries are not as rich as their northern counterparts. And we can see, too, that there is a major difference between Africa and everything outside of Africa. Now, what about time? Is this pattern the same throughout time? Well, when we look at a time lapse of GDP per capita, and I've taught you before why we maybe wouldn't want to trust historical data, but regardless of individual, let me put it this way. I don't take historical GDP per capita too seriously, but if you look at the actual lifestyle of how peasants live, the calories they eat, the kind of food they eat, the kind of clothes they wear, how many personal possessions they have, even if the numbers are skewed, the general point of this graph is correct. Was the rich part of the world always rich? Was the poor part of the world always poor? Well, no. In fact, one thing we see is that before we get to that industrial revolution, which I've lectured on before with y'all, before about 1800, there is no big difference between different people. We start to see that around 1500, the Europeans start to grow slowly while everyone else stagnates. But 1800, and it just takes off like a rocket. The US, keep in mind that before, 1800, a large chunk of the US is Indians. The US booms, and it booms far faster than anyone else. The Western Europeans boom. The Eastern Europeans, they don't really start to boom until 1950 on. The Japanese don't start to boom until 1950 on. And there are still parts of the world that never really took off at all when you speak of India and Africa. This graph's a little old because India is actually, if it went all the way up to 2020, you would see that India has started its boom, but Africa still stagnant. With a scale that large, it also hides certain more nuanced regional differences. If you were living in the Middle Ages, you would consider the greatest city on earth, the wealthiest, most impressive city on earth, to be Baghdad in Iraq. If you lived in ancient times, very, very ancient, Mesopotamia, it would be Babylon in Iraq. In later years, you might have said one of the wealthy cities of China. And yet the fates have completely flipped. Well, how can we explain this? If you ask someone, like if you just go to someone on the street and ask them what makes a nation rich, one thing they're likely to guess is resources. And of course, we understand that with technological change, which resources matter can change too. Perhaps there were resources in Babylon and Baghdad that were more valuable back then. But when we look at resources, we find that that can't really explain it. Take this graph of natural resources by percent of GDP as an example. You would expect that if resources was what made a country rich, then the more of them they have, or the more important they are relative to the economy, the richer the country should be. And yet, if anything, it looks to be the exact opposite. Africa has very valuable metal deposits. It has very valuable diamond deposits. Africa happens to have a lot of oil. And yet Africa is mired in poverty. Parts of Central Asia have large resource deposits. Kazakhstan, #1 exporter of potassium. Venezuela with oil. Bolivia with various metals. Probably copper, I imagine, is probably the big one there. Let's say that we want to break it down by deposit. Maybe the resources aren't expected to be a big chunk of your GDP, but the access to them matters. Well, let's look at iron and copper. I could go over dozens of different types of metal, but we'll focus on the two big ones. Iron, what our modern world is built out of, the structures that we live in, most of the tools that we use. It's the skeleton of our world. And where is the iron made? Well, some of the iron is coming from rich countries. Canada, Scandinavia, Australia are all big mining countries. And yet you also see that there are large iron deposits in Africa, in Russia, which is a poor country by, American standards, in China, a poor country, in Brazil. How about copper? The fuel of the, or not the fuel, but the nerves of the modern electrical world. The nerves of the 20th century world. If it was a matter of the time in which a resource is valuable, then we would expect that surely the Europeans must be loaded with copper. Well, America's loaded with copper. Chile, a prosperous country, is loaded with copper. But so is Indochina. So is Iran. So is Turkey. So is the Philippines. So are many poor countries. And although I don't really have a graph showing this, some of the richest nations on Earth don't really have many meaningful resources at all. Now, I think it's important to note that resources don't have to mean metal you pull out of the ground or fuel. People will sometimes dishonestly tell you that extremely capitalistic Singapore is rich despite having no resources. Well, Singapore happens to have a harbor that's on one of the most frequented trade routes in the world. That is its resource. But it is true that there are countries which lack a good balance of fuel and metal and yet are still able to prosper anyways. That's true of most of Europe. And while they do have a quite a bit of copper, Japan and South Korea don't really have much of anything else. It seems like resources are neither necessary nor sufficient for a modern economy to grow. Could it be climate? Well, like maybe we're looking in the wrong place. Maybe we should be talking about agriculture instead of industry. Of course, agriculture isn't a huge chunk of GDP today, but maybe it's a necessary condition. But you can't explain it off of agriculture. Climate does change around the world over time, but it doesn't change so dramatically that cold forests become sweltering desert. Back in this long period of ancient through medieval days, your most prosperous countries were mostly in this humid subtropical / desert region of the world. Nowadays, it's mostly in the colder temperate environments. Climate and agriculture can't explain why the world is the way it is. At best, it can be a necessary condition that you must be able to support a population. But it can't by itself explain why countries today are wealthy or are not wealthy. Well, let's start to look at some more maps and see if we can identify any patterns that emerge. Take, for example, this map of democracy around the world. Now, democracy is subjective. Frankly, I don't put a lot of stock in people measuring that either. For example, the idea that the US is a worse democracy than Europe is a crock of shit. There are a lot of European countries where you can be arrested for saying mean things about other people. But while I don't particularly value the relative rankings within a group, this is pretty accurate in marking out who's a dictatorship and who does have representative government. Because a lot of dictatorships claim to be democracies. Well, do you see some patterns starting to emerge? Do you see a certain part of the globe that is notably less democratic than the rest? Do you see a kind of middle area that's struggling but isn't crippled with poverty? It seems to match up remarkably well, doesn't it? It matches up way better than a climate or resource-based argument would. The more democratic a country is, the wealthier it seems to be. Of course, we don't know yet why that is. It could be that the causation is the other way around, that a wealthy country is more likely to become democratic. This is something we'll consider. Here's another important one. Let's talk about the impact of communism on a society. It's not really communism that matters, it's more economic freedom in general. Not having a command economy, not having the socialist or economic calculation problem. Let's do some comparisons. Look how up in Europe there's that divide between West and East. Now, Eastern Europe is still wealthy by global standards, but by European or American standards, it's poor. It's a shared civilization. They're both white countries. They're both Christian. They both have a legacy of Greco-Roman culture. It seems that with a few little exceptions, that border between what was communist and what isn't is also the border between success and poverty. Down in Southeast Asia, notice how the one country that didn't go communist or otherwise heavily Soviet aligned is also the one country that's doing better than its neighbors. Notice how the Middle East is, for the most part, doing better than India. India is not considered a Middle Eastern country, but you could make that comparison. Notice how, like, Egypt had a socialist government, Sudan had a socialist government, India had a socialist government. They're poorer than places like Saudi Arabia and Iran and Turkey. In Africa and Latin America, it's not that clear. But still, this impact on Eastern Europe and Asia is remarkable. And certainly these two are linked. How democratic a society is today and whether or not it was communist in the past. There is a direct connection. Okay, now here's another thing I'm going to point out to you. I've got a map here of how white a country is. White, European, they're the same thing. White is an arbitrary word, right? There are a lot of people around the world that aren't typically considered white, but they look as white as you or me. Iranians are one such. They literally share a common ancestry with Europeans. But just know that I might use either word interchangeably. Do you see a pattern with European settlement? The North, the South, and then middle levels in Latin America. Essentially, even South Africa. This one is easy to forget if you're not like into South African history, which I am, but even South Africa is wider than the rest of Africa, and it's wealthier than the rest of Africa by quite a bit, too. It's the part of the globe that does not have a large white population that's doing poorly. Okay. And this also seems to more or less link up with democracy to a large extent too. Not so much with communism, right? Russia is a wider country than America, but it went communist. We didn't. But that's one correlation. communism and democracy seem to be at odds. How European a country is seems to be in line with how democratic it is as a rule, provided it didn't go communist. Can we explain this as being caused by race itself? Probably not. That's a question that a lot of professors wouldn't even ask. They would fall all over themselves immediately, saying, no, that can't possibly be the case. That's racist to even suggest it. Well, this explanation can't work because if there was some kind of biological difference, or even say a cultural one, maybe you say, well, it's not about them being European, it's about in an ethnic sense, it's about the European culture they imposed. Well, if that were the case, then we would expect these European regions to have been doing better from the start. When Baghdad and Babylon were the greatest cities in the world, Europe was a backwater. Europe was considered a trashy place. You can't explain it through biology or culture like that. If it's culture, then it's not, then it's a cultural change that has emerged more recently. Notice too some other things. Again, the South Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Japanese, they're all Oriental, and they all share a common kind of Confucian Buddhist heritage with China and with Southeast Asia. Yet there's a big dividing line between them. We can't race is clearly playing a role in this story, but it's not race itself that's doing it. Now, what else can we say about the world? Here I've got a map of European empire. Now, you can kind of quibble about what counts as having been colonized and what hasn't. For example, Liberia was colonized, but it was colonized by blacks from America instead of whites. Ethiopia, on the other hand, was briefly occupied by Italy, but it was never actually colonized. Like, you can get into arguments about which of these countries should be shaded what, but in general, Europe conquered the world. In the space of several centuries, the conquest of the New World began about 500 years ago. The conquest of the rest of the world began closer to 150 years ago. And then it all collapsed 50 to 100 years ago. The European empires all fell apart during the Cold War. They decided to go home. What kind of impact did that leave? Well, we already know that the whiter countries tended to do better, all else being equal. But notice that the countries that were never colonized at all tended to do better than the ones that were, but were not settled. For example, focus on Asia for a moment. Japan doesn't get colonized. Japan does colonize South Korea. So that's a complication. But Japan does not get colonized by Europe. They turn out rich. They turn out, well, admittedly, this has more to do with us invading them than anything else, but they turn out democratic. They don't adopt a communist government. Japan essentially does everything right so far. And they end up much richer than China. Down in Southeast Asia, I had already pointed out that Thailand there didn't go communist. Thailand didn't get colonized. And they end up richer than all their neighbors. Yeah, well, Malaysia's a little richer. In the Middle East, it's a little hard to see on this PowerPoint, but you see Israel. That's essentially a European colony. The Jews may have lived there thousands of years ago. They're Europeans at this point. Their culture migrated to, evolved in Europe, and then later came back, starting in the 1800s, settling on land that was inhabited by Arabs. They're doing better than their neighbors. This story, whatever's going on, even Iran, right? Even Iran. The reason Afghanistan's so poor is because we spent the last 2 decades blowing it up. Iran's not doing as good as the Saudis, but they're doing better than some of their immediate neighbors. There's a story that you can weave out of all of these facts, things which individually don't seem to have a lot of explanatory power, and which collectively can seem a little overwhelming. But there is a story we can tell here. And the story of growth is one of representative government, and it ties heavily into colonialism. See, now this happens to be a little repetitive because I just taught you labor unions and Marxism. But for most of history, most societies are hierarchical, authoritarian, and unfree. There's always markets, but there's not always market economies or capitalist societies like we think of it. People will always create markets on their own. If you give little Timmy an apple to eat for lunch and little Johnny a candy bar to eat for lunch, they'll start a market. They'll start trading with each other. But that's different from having a society where most of the necessities of life are controlled by essentially this freely floating system of prices where people produce and sell voluntarily, motivated mainly by self-interest. There's a difference between that versus a society that's run primarily by some sort of collective planning or by tradition. And these societies, they all have serfdom in some form. They all have a nobility in some form, and the serfs are not going to get to vote. And there's a phrase we're going to use for this: extractive institutions. Your society is controlled by a clique of people who use their power to extort wealth from the lower classes. Just like Marx said. And it's going to be a self-reinforcing process too, for reasons we'll later get into. You get a vicious cycle of repression where the more extractive, the more extortionate the government is, the worse it's going to be in the future. It's very difficult for the system to reform itself or for revolution to succeed because the system ends up incentivizing the same bad behaviors even more the worse the system gets. But what changes is a perfect storm of conditions in Northwestern Europe. I say Northwestern Europe, I'm talking countries like Britain, Ireland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Scandinavia with Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, Germany, these countries. And this perfect storm is going to lead to the creation of a new kind of society that is more democratic in its planning instead of hierarchical, that's more egalitarian in its values, and that's based on a system of free labor. And this we're going to call inclusive institutions. They're institutions where instead of the ruling class being rewarded primarily for violently extracting resources from other people, They instead revolve more around cooperation and creating broader wealth that circulates throughout the society. And this is going to entail giving people some say in how they're ruled. And as we'll see, this too is a self-reinforcing process. And it's going to lead to a virtuous cycle of reform. So what we'll find is that political and economic systems shape each other in their image. Political outcomes are going to be determined by the economic structure. Those who have control of resources are going to generally control the political system. Because political power ultimately goes back to mainly military power. And military power is based on some kind of logistics. But those political elites are also going to shape the economic structure to their liking. They're going to shape the economic structure in a way that's not just rewarding to them, but that also secures their own power base. So when you have different systems, each system is going to work on the other to make them more compatible until eventually they merge into some sort of synthesis of the systems. What we'll find is that inclusive institutions rewarded growth. They rewarded growth because they rewarded the accumulation of wealth created by technological progress and development. The only way that a society can get richer in the long run is by embracing new technology. And in societies that had a more representative government, that was more likely to happen. It was more likely to be accepted. In societies that had extractive institutions, on the other hand, they don't do this. Technological growth can help the ruler by creating more resources to steal, but they can also threaten the ruler by undermining the economic structure that puts them in power. And so countries with heavy extractive institutions were going to focus on redistributing wealth from workers to rulers. One system revolved around creating new wealth and sharing it. The other system revolved around fighting over an existing pool of wealth, even if the fight ended up reducing the total amount available. And where this ties into colonialism is that European colonization was going to play a huge role in the shaping of colonies. See, wherever there was a civilization to plunder or cash crops to farm with slaves, Europeans ended up building colonies based around extraction. I can give you examples here. Remember on that map how the north, right, North America above the Rio Grande was wealthy and white. The southern cone of South America is wealthy and white. South Africa is wealthy and mostly black, but it's whiter than the rest of Africa. And likewise with Australia and New Zealand. Essentially, little copies of Canada down there. On the other hand, there was very little of a white population in India, Southeast Asia in general, and Africa. And there was a moderate white population in the rest of Latin America. What do the Spanish find when they go to Mexico? They find advanced civilization. They find a city, Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City, that's bigger than any city in Europe. They find a population of people who already have a system of serfdom, who already have nobility. The Aztecs are a slave society. They stay in a constant state of war with their neighbors, terrorizing them, ripping them off for tribute, kidnapping their people. They're an agrarian society. These are people who already know to farm. They've already built up dense populations. There may be over 1 million of them in Tenochtitlan alone. And so when the Spanish roll up on that world, all they do is they just kill off the leadership and replace them. You have a world that is already extractive in nature, and the Spanish just set themselves up as new extractors, as new thugs. What about the Andes in Peru and Bolivia? The same story plays out, except with the Inca Empire instead. What about with India? The same story plays out, except instead of Spanish conquistadors, it's the British East India Company. A private corporation comes in and plunders the place. And then they move in and turn it into one giant glorified plantation. And then it goes socialist after it wins independence. What's going on in the Caribbean and in Brazil? Plantation slavery. In those parts of the New World, you don't really have a large population. You don't have a large empire that you can just move in and conquer. But you do have a climate that's capable of producing very valuable crops: coffee, sugar, chocolate, tobacco, things that can be sold back to Europe and raise enough money to import the workforce. And so these countries are going to be a mixture of Black and Indian and white, what Latinos call pardo people. And the same is true in the American South, generally poorer than the rest of America. What about elsewhere? Well, there's Indians in the North, in Canada, in Argentina, and Chile, and Australia and New Zealand. There's Indians or Aborigines, but there's not as many of them. They don't have civilization, or they don't have civilization at the same scale. If you conquer their territory, you can't really force them to work for you because they'll just move off deeper into the frontier. You don't have a rich climate that rewards having big plantations that would make it worth your while to transport slaves across the Atlantic. All you can really do in those environments is just farm for yourself and manufacture. And so in these places that have lower populations, the Europeans are going to build settler colonies. But whenever they build a settler colony, whenever they build a country that is going to be primarily populated by immigrants from the homeland, they're going to have to offer people a better deal in order to get them to willingly move there. They have to offer things like representation, better lives, better conditions, individual freedoms. And this is going to open up inclusive institutions, if just a little. It's going to be the crack in the door that allows them to force open the door, to throw open the door, so that everyone can feast at the same table. In some places, this doesn't happen as dramatically. In South Africa, for example, they have a large Black population, but they also have a large white population, and it just kind of balances out. You'll sometimes hear South Africa described as being a first world country stapled to a third world country. The white portions of it, especially because there are regions that are primarily Boer, that would be Dutch South Africans, or they're primarily British South African. those regions will look a lot more like Europe, and then the rest of the country will look more like Africa. Because investment isn't the same throughout it. Representation until the last 30 years wasn't the same throughout it. South Africa was the last nation on earth to maintain a white segregationist government, to maintain its own version of Jim Crow called apartheid. But compared to other nations that had no real representation at all because it was purely the colonial government terrorizing everyone, like, say, the Congo, South Africa ends up coming out better off. And in the countries that don't get colonized, they don't get looted. The extraction is the natural way of the world. Extraction is why this takeoff is so slow. Clearly, there was nothing about science itself that prevented people from inventing new technologies at a faster rate. There's nothing about the theory that makes that hard. What it is there's a lack of incentive to do it. There was a problem with the basic social structure, with the system I told you about, that made change difficult to implement, that made change difficult to conceive of. If the Europeans had never gotten on their ships and sailed off to foreign shores to conquer and enslave and plunder, the rest of the world would look about the same as it does now. It's not that the colonies make these countries poor, but it's that the colonies, depending on the type of colony they are, prevent this process from taking place. They prevent this transformation to inclusive institutions. They close off a possible development path. It was only in those fringes of the world, only in those far-flung corners that weren't heavily settled up, that people had the ability to form governments based on more rational principles that would be able to break the cycle. But once they do it, they create an example which other countries were later able to follow. One thing that this topic will try to answer is, why could the colonies not just reform themselves after colonization ended? And you'll get that later in the topic. A country doesn't have to be completely defined by its past, as we clearly see in our own country. But when the past shapes your present circumstances to make it more difficult to reform, you still get that vicious cycle. You might change who's holding the leash, but you don't change the leash around you. And near the end of it, we'll see why the brutality of communism was predictable. Why did this ideology that promised democracy, not just democracy, but a fuller expression of democracy, a more expansive concept of democracy that would extend equality into spheres that it didn't originally share? Why did every People's Republic or Democratic People's Republic or union of socialist republics turn into such a hellhole? And we'll see the answer with that too. And it comes down to that totalitarianism breeds authoritarianism. Um, Pardon me for that little flub. This topic takes about 2 weeks during the fall and spring semester. For this last week, for this last topic, we'll explore these concepts through the ideas of three great interlinked economists in two fields: the growth field and another field that is varyingly called political economy or public choice. Now, political economy could be described as how economies and political systems affect each other. Back in the day, it's just the old-timey way of saying economics, similar to how philosophy was what they used to call science before science came along, or how alchemy was what they called chemistry. Likewise, everyone was a political economist before they just dropped the political from it. But public choice theory, developed by the great Tennessean economist James Buchanan, not the same guy as the president, it kind of revived the political aspect of economics to, say, how can we use our economics methodology, our economics tool set to deal with questions of political life? He essentially wanted to merge political science with economics into one thing. And our three economists are going to be Robert Solow, the Austrian school economist Joseph Schumpeter, and the Turkish American Darren Acemoglu. And their arguments can be summed up through sort of this bullet point list, this flow of Solow. Growth has limits, a steady state. An economy can't grow forever just off of capital accumulation. Joseph Schumpeter, the limits of growth are pushed by creative destruction or technological change. And finally, Darren Acemoglu, authoritarian societies shackle creative destruction. And together, these can explain a lot about why the world is the way it is. Well, we'll start back right on our Solow growth model. So I'll see you in the next one.